Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome once again. So, finally, 9 years after starting this channel, I can now say that I have read every single original Ian Fleming James Bond work, and I was able to do that at quite a leisurely pace over the past year, and you can find detailed reviews of each Ian Fleming novel on my channel. One of the main things that surprised me about this read-through was the wildly varying quality from entry to entry in some cases. I mean, some of the books rank amongst the very best stuff I've ever read, whereas other ones are an absolute slog to get through. So I'm really looking forward to this ranking, and so I will be ranking all 14 Ian Fleming books. That's the 12 novels and the 2 short story collections. I'll be ranking the short story collections as works as a whole, rather than individual stories, because I don't think it's terribly fair to be comparing a single short story to a full novel. So, with that in mind, let's get started, shall we, with the very bottom of the list and the weakest Bond book, Diamonds Are Forever. This one was probably the only one that was a real genuine struggle for me to get through, and I couldn't have found better conditions for reading this. I mean, I was on holiday, I was relaxing, I needed some, beach lounging entertainment, and what better than a Bond book? Well, the story of this one is basically Bond going from gangster to gangster, traveling around America as he tries to get to the top of this smuggling ring, and he spends a good chunk of the story actually lamenting that this mission isn't really for him, and he's bored and he can't wait to get back to his usual stuff. And when the protagonist of the story is saying that, I mean, how the heck is the reader supposed to feel? At times it feels like Fleming himself, like he started the story and then he kind of just got a bit bored with it and realised he didn't have that much to work with, but he'd written a good chunk of the thing, so he might as well finish it. And a recurring dislike of the Fleming books for me is how he writes dialogue for American gangsters, and there's a lot of that in here, that kind of like 1930s movie, James Cagney, Edward G. Robinson kind of thing, and it just sounds so unrealistic and tacky and outdated, even for the 1950s, 1960s when he was writing these things. It just feels like Fleming was really into gangsters and smuggling at this time for some reason, so that's why we have this book. And sure enough, not too long after Diamonds, he would publish a non-fiction work called The Diamond Smugglers, which covers diamond security and smuggling details and the like, and I just wish he'd just written that book in the first place and get all that out of his system rather than try to get that stuff into an actual James Bond story. In terms of what works about the book, I think there's a really cool action sequence involving a train towards the end, and the story does feature my very favourite Fleming-penned Bond girl in Tiffany Case, and Fleming doesn't really write women very differently. I mean, Solitaire has almost the exact same voice as Tracy, for example, who sounds just like Mary Goodnight, but Tiffany sticks out because she's really tough and I think multi-dimensional. I love the conversations between her and Bond on the boat at the end of the book, and those were some of my very favourite passages to read, but overall there just wasn't much in Diamonds Are Forever that kept me gripped. Speaking of stories that I wish Fleming had gotten out of his system in another way, we come to The Spy Who Loved Me, and this was obviously something of an experimental work from Fleming, being the only Bond story which is largely told from the perspective of a different character. Bond doesn't show up until about 2/3 of the way through the book, so instead we just have the life story, and I'm really not exaggerating that point, of Vivian Michelle, who in summary has a bad history with men and a bit of a crummy life, and she's working at this motel now, and some more wise guy, gangsters turn up, and there's some kind of insurance scam going on or something, and then Bond appears and action happens. The main problem is that a huge chunk of the story is just Viv talking about her life, and it's just not that interesting. It's very domestic and kitchen sink stuff, and I just kept waiting for the moment when, okay, this is all gonna tie together in some way. All these different men that she's dating, they're all gonna be part of some organization, or they're gonna be undercover, or they're gonna come back or something. They're gonna own the motel, but no, it's just a girl has had a hard life. And I get that that's the point of the thing, and it's intended to be more of a domestic character piece, but especially when it's from a female perspective, I don't think Fleming can write women very well, so having an entire book of that is not the best. I think I like this one slightly more than Diamonds Are Forever, purely because I do kind of like the experimental nature of it in concept, and that Fleming was trying something so radically different from his usual stuff, and it didn't work in my opinion, but it's just interesting to see an author quite working through some kind of writer's block he was having, like, on the page. Like, he needed to make this so that he could go on, so that he could get back to form and go on to write a couple of the very best Bond stories of all time, which we will get to a little later. As I mentioned in my full review for this one, I feel like it's kind of... It feels wrong to speak ill of The Man with the Golden Gun. It's an incomplete work written by a man very much coming to the end of his life, and he wasn't even happy with it, so yeah, it's no surprise that it's not one of the best. There are still some interesting concepts in here, don't get me wrong, and the opening with Bond and M is really quite gripping, and I suppose I just wanted something with a bit more going on. It's a very superficial story, and with Bond being in such a strange headspace after the events of the previous novels, and I would have liked to have that more explored. I would have appreciated something a bit more cerebral, I guess, than what we actually get. The big villain scheme in this one kind of exemplifies the fatigue of the whole story. It's this kind of hodgepodge of, like, there's a bit of gambling in here, and then there's some drug dealing, and then there's some prostitution, and then there's some kind of generation of civil unrest going on, and then there's a Russian guy here for some reason, and it just all ends up feeling a bit vague, and I had to have people explain, like, what the plot really was for the villains, like, after the fact, because it just felt so, like, not lazy, because it feels unfair to call it lazy, it just feels tired, and it's obviously understandable that the story is feeling tired because it was being written by a dying man. There's one chapter towards the end of the book involving the villain Scaramanga and Bond in a swamp that I think is absolutely phenomenal and one of the best pieces of writing in any of these Bond stories. One of the really genuinely a highlight chapter of the series for me. It's just dull. I mean, and when you add on top of that, like, the real world knowledge that we have now of, like, how it was written with Fleming coming towards the end of his life and being very ill and everything, it just doesn't make for very fun reading. Bonden America always seems to be a tricky thing, whether you're talking about the books or the films. It's just, there's something that just always feels odd about it, and some of the films get away with it, don't get me wrong, but in the books, every time Bond goes to America, we get so much of just Fleming's dislike and bitterness about the place and the people and the culture. There's a lot of it in Diamonds Are Forever, but it's very much born in Live and Let Die, and it just makes for a little bit of a miserable read in places. One of the consistent elements that makes this series unique is the world view, very much Fleming's own, that he imbues the whole series with. A lot of the sidebars he takes about Britain's role in the world and other cultures and such can be very interesting, informative, and entertaining, but at their worst, they just come off like some old man grumbling in the pub about how things ain't what they used to be, and that's very much how it feels in this book. However, Mr. Big is a cool villain, and while I'm not so keen on his evil scheme involving pirate gold, he has some good exchanges with Bond, and similarly, I like that we have Bond and Felix's relationship being strengthened and solidified here, and Felix, of course, becomes a great ally for Bond in future stories, so yeah, if you can get through all of the anti-American stuff that's in here, there are plenty of elements to enjoy, but it's far from essential reading. Knowing how much legal trouble the Thunderball story has caused the Bond series, I came to this book with high expectations. I don't really care for either film adaptation of the work, but I was like, well, you know what, if it caused so much trouble, there must be something really special about it, and it's fine? This was, of course, a story that Fleming wrote after he'd been developing it as a film with people, Kevin McClory and Jack Whittingham, and so it's an amalgamation of a lot of people's ideas, and Fleming just kind of took all those ideas and used them for a book, and then, hence, decades-long legal tussles were born. But But that aside, there is still an awful lot to enjoy in Thunderball. Bond and Felix's relationship is really great, and they have a lot of especially great banter in this particular story, and the underwater action works a hell of a lot better on the page and in readers' imaginations than it does in the films, where it just plays very slow. I guess the book just suffers from being kind of like middle of the road. It's like, that's another Bond book, I suppose. And as it was released in a period where it followed a collection of short stories and preceded The Spy Who Loved Me, it just feels like Fleming was in a bit of a creative lull and had to make releases out of stories he'd previously written, stories incorporating other people's ideas, and a story that's barely recognizable as a Bond novel. So, especially when reading the books in sequence, you feel that fatigue and you feel, been there, done that quality. But I plan on revisiting Thunderball actually very soon out of that sequence, because I can imagine it reads a hell of a lot better when you're not kind of going straight from one to the other like I did for this read-through, and it might help the story overall to experience it like that. But you know what? I enjoyed my first reading experience, just not one of the best. So this is where the ranking gets a little bit tricky, but for clarity, I'm ranking the short stories by the collections in which they are grouped. So for this one, I'm also including 007 in New York and Property of a Lady, and just like the other short story collection in this series, it's a real mixed bag. If I had to rank the short stories in this particular collection from best to worst, it would be Octopussy, The Living Daylights, Property of a Lady, and 007 in New York, and I just did a ranking within a ranking. This is like the Inception of ranking videos. Octopussy is a real favourite for me, and well worth reading just by itself if you can find it in isolation. I don't know if it's a really great Bond story, I don't think it is. Bond is hardly in it, but you really feel that Fleming was reflecting on his own life in the character of Dexter Smythe, this old bloke in poor health living in Jamaica, and it's a really macabre, melancholic story. I just love it. The Living Daylights, on the other hand, represents a more typical Bond story with some good spy action and thrilling, suspenseful moments. And Property has a scene that's quite good, but it's just quite dull, really. And 007 in New York is never anything I would recommend to anyone, unless you're looking for a fairly decent scrambled eggs recipe. It's a mixed bag of work, no doubt, but overall a very fine reading experience. Of course, I know that 007 in New York and Property of a Lady were not included in this collection when it was first published, way back when. It was only Octopussy and the Living Daylights in that book, but I feel like it's quite common for these four stories to be grouped together now, so that's why I'm including them this way. I'm just saying that because I know I'm going to get comments about how can you rank this all together, it wasn't published like that, but gotta rank them somehow, right? Similar to Thunderball, Goldfinger has that quality of being like, oh well, yeah, that was another Bond book, and don't get me wrong, there are many things to enjoy in both of those stories, but they just so happen to be two books that I came away from like thinking like, yeah, well, that was another one. But Goldfinger himself is one of the very best villains in the series, and Oddjob is really cool too, even though there is that bizarre development in which Goldfinger hires Bond to be his personal assistant, which oddly enough becomes a recurring thing in the book series, and it's certainly not something that I thought I would be reading when I started this journey. Pussy Galore is a cool character too. I guess I just like it more when Fleming writes tough women instead of the waifish damsels in distress that he so often does, and the film is deservedly the definitive version of this story, I feel. It improves on almost every single aspect of the book, but the book is nonetheless a perfectly breezy and fun read that I would recommend. Again, another short story collection that's a real mixed bag, so let's do our Inception stuff again. Okay, I'm Leonardo DiCaprio going into Cillian Murphy. So, The Hildebrand Rarity is my favourite of this particular collection, and my favourite Bond short story of them all. It's certainly not a great example of espionage and spy storytelling, but it's just, on its own right, it's just so weird, macabre little story, and yet one that Bond feels entirely relevant in. The ending is just wonderful, and all the supporting characters are really great. I love this story, and highly recommend it. For Your Eyes Only and A View to a Kill follow in a very closely run race. They're both just really nice, nifty little spy stories in their own right, just cool little mini missions, and some of the stories in this collection were born out of Fleming working out outlines for episodes of a potential James Bond TV show that never happened, and he took those outlines and then turned them into stories, and you can really imagine both of these playing out as like a 50-minute episode on TV. It's a quality they share with Risiko as well, which is the next in my ranking of these particular short stories, which is just a nice little idea, and you can imagine it as part of a 50s TV schedule. I like Risiko a lot. It's another small, nifty little spy story with some fun characters and an interesting twist. Works very well. The same cannot be said for Quantum of Solace, which is one of the most boring Bond stories, and just another writing experiment from Fleming that has absolutely no business being a Bond story, but here we are talking about it. Bond is only in the story in as much as, the main purpose is that he's hearing this anecdote about a married couple, and he's told this story, and he does go away as a bit of a changed man as a result of the morals and lessons he reads into this story, but really it does just feel like Fleming heard an interesting bit of gossip about some people he knew and the phrase Quantum of Solace and decided to make it a published work. I mean, there's even a bit where Bond is he hears the phrase Quantum of Solace and he's like, what a brilliant phrase, that's fantastic, and it just sounds like Fleming patting himself on the back. And yet, despite the issues that I have with Quantum, it is a very short story and it doesn't diminish a collection of really amazing to very good stories featuring 007. I'm not sure if I undervalue this one or not. I mean, it is often held in a very high regard, and it does feel to have its own identity before the rest of the series, featuring very few of the tropes we have come to expect from a 007 adventure. Casino Royale is a really tight story, which is somewhat surprising given Fleming's self-admitted loose and casual writing process. It just works so well and so economically. It's one of the shorter books in the series, but it does a phenomenal job of establishing the James Bond character, and while this would change somewhat as the books go on, I love the Bond in this story. I even really like that he has something of a character arc in his attitude towards women, with Vesper making him question some of his prejudices, and there's some really lovely, almost philosophical discussions about good and evil, and we learn a lot about Bond's views on life and the world in this story. As something of a general point, now that I've actually read all the books in the series in a close proximity, I do have to challenge the general consensus, the general view that Fleming's Bond was as hard-edged as legend would believe. In a lot of the stories, he's cracking wise and smooth-talking and all that, but here he's certainly a tough old bastard and the truest representation of the hard-edged Bond. It's a really great start to the series, but much the same as how I feel that Dr. No just kind of set a good template and some good ideas that were evolved upon in future entries. That's kind of how I feel about this. I feel like it's a really great story in its own right, but others just came along and built upon it and came out even better. But that's not to diminish the incredible work that is Ian Fleming's Casino Royale, and it's certainly required reading for every Bond fan. If Casino Royale ranks a little low in comparison to other lists, then I think that my love of Unitive Twice has it rank much higher than you would conventionally find, and I understand that there isn't too much love for this novel, and yet I can kind of see why. It's beyond the conventions of what both Fleming previously established and what the movie series would go on to establish, but I really adore the hazy, dreamlike quality this story carries. Bond goes further afield than ever before in this story, and with Japan being a culture that's so wildly different and alien to him, and on top of that he has to deal with all of these incredibly melancholic and self-destructive emotions, and also while lamenting Britain's diminished place in the world order, and I just love how all of this is explored through Bond's conversations with new characters that he meets. Beyond that, there's just a terrific pair of villains in Blofeld and Irma Bunt who have just become this deranged, hideous couple, and I love that Bond has to do battle with such a pair, considering his huge personal loss at the end of the previous book, and their dastardly scheme is also just so completely nuts in the best possible way, and some of the passages and descriptions of Bond making his way through the villain's garden of death have really stayed with me since reading it, and I find them genuinely quite haunting. Unitive Twice marks the start of the god tier Bond stories for me, and while I have ranked them as such, quite honestly, the rest of the stories on this list can be somewhat interchangeable. These are 5 stories I will be returning to when I want to experience really great Fleming stories. So without further ado, let's move on to my number 4 ranking. From Wed Love was the very first Bond book I ever read back when I was like 12 or 13 after finding a second-hand hardback in a second-hand bookshop in Haworth in the north of England, and I took it on a family holiday and read the whole thing, and it was just absolutely fantastic. It's a real testament to the quality of writing that a full third of the book takes place without Bond himself in it, as we learn the backstory of Red Grant and a lot of detail about the villainous scheme being put together to kill James Bond, and sometimes Fleming can go a little overboard with the baddie's plans, and it feels like he's just congratulating himself on how intricate and well thought out they are. Here, though, it just reads so well, and it's a brave decision to tell the audience exactly what is going to happen, and not let them go on the ride of discovery, but it works really well and gives the story a real sense of prolonged suspense that I think is actually quite unique to the series. The whole thing is just so well plotted and features the Bond character on top form. If you only have an interest in dipping your toes into 1 or 2 Fleming stories, then this one comes highly recommended. On Her Majesty's Secret Service came after a period of Fleming fatigue and follows some of the less exciting books in the series, most notably The Spy Who Loved Me, and whatever Fleming needed to get out of his system with that story, he apparently got out, because On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a masterpiece, and in terms of writing itself, I think it's Fleming's greatest work and the one that he should be most remembered for. Of course, this is only ranking number 3 on my list because this is a personal list and there just happen to be 2 of the books in the series that push more of my own personal buttons, but if I were to speak objectively, then I think that this is undoubtedly the best. I'm certainly no expert on great literature, but even with my own rudimentary understanding, I can tell you that a lot of what Fleming writes is pulpy entertainment, which occasionally stumbles into something deeper, and Majestys is so well crafted, the structure of the story, the themes, the Bond character, everything is firing on full cylinders, and it's just an absolute delight to read, and makes for a great pairing with its sequel book, Unitive Twice. So, what would rank higher than Fleming's masterpiece? Let's take a look. I might love this one because tonally, I find it very similar to the tone I like best in the films. It has a serious but over-the-top villain with an amazing lair and crazy plan and intriguing plot, and the Bond character, I think, at his most jovial. This really was a turning point in the book series, I found, with Bond becoming wittier, cracking wise, and a little more sardonic. There's still a seriousness and a grit to him, but I appreciate the occasional light-hearted witticism. Beyond that, I think that the plot is just so well constructed and a really good mystery for a while, and Honeychild Rider is one of the better Bond girls of the series and feels like the ultimate Fleming vision of a Bond girl, even if she does get a little bit Disney princess at times with some of her animal friends. And yeah, things do get a little bit silly in places. Dr. No's whole physical trial thing set up to test Bond's physical endurance is quite daft, and really, particularly the bit with the giant sea beast he goes up against. But you know what, I love it. I love it when Fleming does become fantastical, and while he never goes quite as far into that territory as the films do, there is a kind of grandeur, larger-than-life concepts in a lot of his work, and I love that. Dr. No was the book that I finished the quickest in this read-through. I really couldn't put it down, and yet there is still one more Bond story that is my absolute favourite Fleming Bond novel. Which is Moonraker, and if anyone asked me to recommend them just one Fleming book, like you only have time to read one of his works, then, you know, it would be Moonraker. It serves as a perfect balance of all the necessary Fleming elements and excels on every single one of those. This was only the third Fleming Bond novel, but his writing is just on excellent, entertaining form, and the version of Bond himself that we get in this book is my favourite. It feels like a true continuation of the man and the character arc that was set up in Casino Royale, particularly with his feelings towards Gala Brand, a female agent who he's paired with for the majority of the mission. I can't really pick a favourite chapter or sequence because there's just so much great stuff in here. I absolutely adore Bond and M being together in the early passages of the book, and there's a phenomenal gambling sequence. I love that it's set in England, and it's immediately more relatable to me as a result of that. The villain is just the best in the series, and Hugo Drax and all his backstory and plan is expertly woven into the story, and the climax is the most well-constructed in all of Fleming. I think some of the weaker Fleming works fall hardest when they come to the endings. Some of them just feel like the word count was met so we can wrap things up briskly and economically, but often it just feels very abrupt, but not here. The final few chapters are so suspenseful and exciting. I think I finished the final third of the book in one sitting, I was so enthralled. If you don't or can't work your way through all of the Fleming books, I would recommend Moonraker, Dr. No, and From Russia with Love as good starting points of how good Bond novels can be, and if you like any of those, then I think every Bond fan owes it to themselves to start with Casino Royale and work their way through the whole list like I did. I'm actually quite surprised at how quickly I was able to get through all these books. I mean, I started this review series a year ago, and since then I've absorbed absolutely everything that Ian Fleming penned on James Bond, and I feel like I've gained some extra qualification, like I own a master's degree in James Bond fandom now as a result, but then to say that would imply that it was some kind of work to go through this series, and it really isn't. Like, some of these books are just absolutely phenomenal entertainment, and even in the weaker entries, I think there is something to be enjoyed for everyone. And I just love how much of Ian Fleming's own personality is in these books. I mean, I know I've made light in the past of Ian Fleming's writing process, which, for all intents and purposes, was not the most detailed and thorough by all accounts, but in a way that is almost the series' greatest strength, and in so many ways, Fleming is Bond, and Bond is Fleming, and I think that every Bond fan owes it to themselves to make the necessary pilgrimage through these pages, and I can honestly say that you really will not regret it. So, what's next? Well, there are plenty of Bond continuation novels to read, and I will be working my way through every single one of those, starting with Colonel Sun. And in the meantime, please do head over to my Twitter and Facebook pages, and also my Patreon page if you wish to go that extra level and support this channel in any way that you see fit. And of course, please leave your own rankings of the book series below in the comments. It'd be really good to gauge sort of if there even is a consensus about what the best Bond book is or what the worst one is. And until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.